Welcome to the EDIFY podcast, where our guests share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the EDIFY podcast. I'm your host, Mary Fiorito. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Edward Feser, who is a philosopher and a professor at Pasadena City College, to discuss, among other things, his new book, All One in Christ, A Catholic Critique of Racism and CRT. Edward Feser, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure to have you here. So many interesting things in your background and in your scholarship. Kind of hard to know where to start, but you are a Catholic convert. Can you talk about the role that Thomas Aquinas and his work and writings played in your conversion experience?
Yeah, I guess to be more precise, you could call me a revert. So I was raised Catholic, but I left the church when I was a teenager, and eventually that led me to atheism. And so I was an atheist for about 10 years. Roughly during the 1990s was my atheist period.
Was there anything in particular that led you to atheism? Was it a particular moment or teaching?
It's the sort of thing that happens with a lot of people when they start studying philosophy. And philosophy, of course, is very critical discipline. That is to say, you're always evaluating ideas and asking what can be said for them, what can be said against them, what sort of criticisms might be raised. And so if you're coming at things from a religious point of view, but then you're seeing all these objections to religion, all these arguments raised by atheists and the like, it's a kind of dizzying experience. And you start asking, well, gee, maybe everything I was brought up to believe is wrong and so forth. So it was that kind of philosophical set of criticisms of religion that eventually led me to atheism. But it was the other side of the coin. It was the philosophical justifications of religion or arguments that brought me back. So when I was in grad school during my atheist years, when you're a grad student, later in your career as a grad student, you're given classes to teach, Introduction to Philosophy in my case. So I was teaching a unit on arguments for God's existence while I was teaching undergrads. And it got kind of boring just teaching the usual objections to the arguments and pretending as if they were worthless and could easily be refuted. And I thought, well, it'd be more interesting for the students if I was able to explain to them why anybody would have found these arguments from people like Thomas Aquinas and Leibniz and so forth interesting in the first place. So I went back into the literature and I started studying what defenders of the arguments would say and studying the material in its original context and so forth. And I came to realize, this took a few years, but I came to realize that the arguments were actually much better than they were given credit for. And a lot of the objections raised against them were directed at straw men and caricatures of the arguments. And so that, as I incorporate all this material into my classes, I went from thinking, well, there are a few things you could say in defense of some of these arguments for God, to thinking, well, actually, these are kind of challenging and interesting arguments, to finally thinking, you know what, I think these arguments are correct and I was mistaken. And then that kind of started the way on to a return eventually to the Catholic Church. And Aquinas played a key role in that, and Thomism in general, the whole school of thought deriving from Aquinas.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to hear the stories of either converts or reverts, particularly ones who came at it from such an intellectual and scholarly vantage point.
That's right. Yeah. People think, well, you're never argued into religion. It's always a matter of the heart rather than the head. But, from my point of view, human beings are, we're creatures of emotion, sure, but we're also rational creatures. And so if something's going to be appealing to us, it ultimately has to appeal to both aspects of our nature. And different people are drawn in different ways. Of course, that doesn't mean that, there was not grace operating and divine assistance, but God works through, multiple routes. And in this case, in the case of other people that I've encountered over the years, he can work through the more intellectual route.
I know a lot of your writing is on natural law. How do you approach the natural law generally as a philosopher? And then how do you approach it when it comes to current events like abortion, like critical race theory, et cetera?
One of the key features of natural law, and the reason one of the reasons anyway, that it's referred to as natural law, is that it's an approach to morality which grounds it in human nature. That's why it's natural law, as opposed to convention, as opposed to human custom or man-made law or what have you. And the way that's spelled out in the tradition by thinkers like Aquinas and where his thought is rooted in ideas ultimately going back to Plato and Aristotle, is in a general view of the world that things have, as a matter of objective fact, They have natures or essences. There's just like there's a nature of what, there's what it is to be a tree or what it is to be a bird. And these are things we discover. We don't invent. We don't make them up. We didn't make it up, say, that birds build nests and that they need to find worms to feed their young and so forth. That's just the way they are. And we know that by studying them. Human beings have a nature as well. Ours is much more complex because we're rational animals, unlike these other animals, but we do have a nature and we discover it, we don't invent it. Because we're rational, meaning we can understand the world and think about it and reason about it, we can also reason ourselves into error and mistakes. We can deceive ourselves about our nature, but we do have it nonetheless. And so when we start behaving in ways, or we form social institutions and pass laws in ways that are contrary to our nature, we're bound to lead ourselves into trouble. But one of the important things that I think is overlooked where natural law is concerned, there's a tendency, both where the existence of God is concerned and where the foundations of the moral law are concerned. There's a tendency of some religious people to think, well, these are all ultimately matters of faith, not reason, and that somehow it's even a waste of time to try to approach them through reason. But I think that's a grave mistake. And there are several reasons for this. And one of them is that if you tell people that the demands of morality have no foundation in human nature and no foundation in reason, and you simply have to accept them on the basis of the authority of Scripture or the church, or take them as if they just fell from heaven with no rational foundation, they're just arbitrary commands God made up for some reason. It's much harder for a lot of people, that it's much harder for them to believe that the whole thing has any foundation to it. But even those who do still believe it's real, it's much harder for them to live that way of life if they don't think it in some way corresponds to their nature. When you do believe that it follows from human nature and that it's got a rational foundation, that provides an aid to moral endeavor, to living a good life, because you see it's not an illusion, it's real, it's good for me, and I have a motivation now to strive to live up to the demands of the natural law, even if it's difficult. It's very different if you think, well, the whole thing might just be an illusion and it floats free of anything and it's got no basis. That can be demoralizing and lead people to just despair of ever living up to the demands of morality.
Well, it's also, of course, and I think you've made this point in your writings, it's very tied to teleology. So the idea that certain things have certain purposes. And when we're looking at the pro-life argument, the abortion argument, there is a particular purpose for a uterus. And that particular purpose is to nurture human life once it's conceived. How do you answer that the womb doesn't necessarily need to support unborn human life once it's conceived? Do you have a natural law or a teleological argument to address that particular piece of it?
So the idea of teleology is the idea that things, given their natures, aim or point or are directed at certain ends or outcomes that they have to realize in order to flourish. Everybody sees this as true and never argues with it when we're talking about something outside the human realm. So people know that for a tree to flourish, it's got to sink roots into the ground and take in water, and it's got to achieve a certain measure of stability with those roots or it's going to fall down, that it's got to grow leaves and carry out photosynthesis. They know that a bird to flourish has got to build its nest and gather the worms for the young and all that. And if it doesn't do that, that's bad for the bird. Or if the tree doesn't do the things I described, it's bad for the tree. Everybody knows that. And if you try to say, well, maybe, it's just our opinion, or it's just a matter of our tastes, that's what roots are for, people say that's just stupid. Come on, don't be silly. But then suddenly, if you're talking about a uterus, you're talking about some other human faculty, people think, well, gee, it's all really up to us what it's for. No, it's not. We're made just like trees and birds are made for certain ends and outcomes. And we're made as men and women to be mothers and fathers and so forth. And, sure, we could decide to act against that, but that doesn't mean that that's not actually, as a matter of objective fact, what these things exist for. And it doesn't mean, therefore, that as a matter of objective fact, those things are not actually what's good for us. So what we're doing in that case is we're just deceiving ourselves. We deceive ourselves about all kinds of things, including that. But it doesn't undermine the objective fact that human beings have a teleology as well.
And, it reminds me a little bit of in the Catechism when it talks about intrinsically disordered acts, particularly sexual acts between people of the same biological sex. And I know that there's a great deal of outrage expressed by people who are members of the LGBTQ community, that the church calls them as people intrinsically disordered, which is not what it says. It says that the human sexual organs are ordered towards a particular act. And so something being intrinsically disordered, it's a philosophical term. It's not a term of medical judgment or psychiatric judgment. Have you, in all of your work, kind of taken on that piece of it with the redefinition of marriage and the redefinition of the purpose of marriage?
Oh, sure. I've written on those things over the years. Yeah. And I mean, that particular move you're describing, that particular argumentative move, it's pretty transparent demagoguery. I mean, nobody's saying that any particular person is disordered as a person or something, as somehow a second-class human being. That's not what anybody's saying. The Catechism doesn't say that. But what is being said is that the desires are disordered. But in just the same way that, say, if someone has to borrow an example from Aristotle, who actually says something very similar about sexual desire, even though he's not writing from a Christian or any other scriptural point of view or anything like that, but he talks about eating dirt, for example, as a desire to eat dirt. The modern times it's called pica, it's desire to eat non-nutritious substances like dirt or metals or what have you. Some people have this deeply ingrained desire. Now, that's a disordered desire. It doesn't mean the person's an inferior human being and we shouldn't treat him with respect and all that. There's nothing to do with that. But as a matter of objective fact, that's not what eating's for. And so if people have these deeply ingrained desires to eat metals or dirt or cleanse or these other things, that's disordered. Or if, take me, I'm wearing glasses, right? Because my eyes, aren't what they were 20 years ago. And so my eyes, because of the condition of the retina and all that, and the shape of the eye as it ages and so forth, it's, quote, disordered. That is to say, the eye's made for seeing, but it doesn't do that job as well as it once did. So it's not ordered as perfectly as it used to be to its natural end. Does that mean if I describe myself that way, that I'm somehow bad-mouthing myself and characterizing myself as inferior? No, I'm just describing that my eyes don't function as well. So the idea is that our desires, just like our bodily organs, have a certain teleology. They aim or are pointed at something that they're for. And those can be misdirected and deformed and disordered, just like other aspects of human nature can be. And again, people, when you're not talking about sex, people acknowledge that. They have no problem with it. But when you bring sex up, they freak out and they act like these things are part of their identity. They're not part of one's identity any more than the desire to eat dirt or metal is part of one's identity, or the fact that my eyes don't function as well as they used to is somehow part of my identity as a person.
And of course, just even the teleology of marriage, right? I mean, the government shouldn't have any say in who you're romantically linked with. That's really not the government's, role in your life, is to tell you that whatever your love is love, or whatever phrase we're using these days. The reason the government got involved in institutionalizing marriage from a legal standpoint was to tie biological fathers to their children, because marriage was the one union that could result, because it was conjugal, in a new human life. And it was really to protect the children and not to, acknowledge somebody's love or, romantic interests and desires in the law somehow. And we've gotten so far away from that, about what marriage actually is, that it's almost impossible to have the conversation. We're just seeing the bill that the Senate just voted on, this Defense of Marriage Act or whatever they've called it. And it never really mentions the whole purpose of marriage, which it's just astonishing to me.
One of the ironies here is that you have this general rhetorical point that people on that side of the debate like to trot out, that, well, we need to keep religion separate from politics. We need to keep controversial, contentious religious and moral views out of our laws and so forth. But this new conception of marriage, which is about 20 minutes old, is itself exactly that. It's a contentious, controversial, and I would say just totally wrong conception of marriage that has been being imposed on the entire country through, we're attempting to do so. Well, I mean, it already was imposed through the Supreme Court decision, but they're trying to codify that, as they put it. From a traditional natural law point of view, it's not really possible for a system of laws to be totally neutral about matters of morality. And it's a kind of illusion to think it can be. But the traditional idea is that human-made law supplements the natural law and exists in order to help us to apply it to concrete circumstances and novel conditions and so forth. But it can only ever build on the natural law and never contradict it and never frustrate it. And when it does, as Aquinas argues, it's not true law and has no binding force when it's positively contrary to the natural law. Well, from the point of view of natural law, not just natural law, but all human civilization until about 20 minutes ago, marriage exists fundamentally for the sake of forming families, which means children. Sure, there are cases where that doesn't happen because people are sterile or something, but that's still what our sexual faculties are for, even if sometimes they are dysfunctional and can't, they won't perform because they're worn out or they're damaged or what have you. That's still what the natural end of the faculties is for. And so that's what marriage is for. And so any laws regarding marriage, if they're going to be just laws and rational laws, have to reflect that. And if they're positively contrary to that, then from the point of view of Thomas Aquinas, and not just him, they have no binding force and they're unjust and ought to be repealed if possible.
Well, then let's maybe go down the road a little bit to transgenderism and to this notion that apparently must be accepted in public if you're not to be a bigot, is that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man, and you can be born into the wrong body. How do you approach the transgender craze, particularly among adolescent young girls? It's frightening to me as a mom of an adolescent girl to see how this has just taken hold in every corner of society, including in Catholic schools and in other religious institutions. How do you think this took root so quickly? And how can Catholic parents try to bring truth and light to conversations about transgender people?
You see in the tradition, going back to Plato, if we're talking about the Western philosophical tradition outside the context of Christianity and before it, and in Thomas Aquinas, within the tradition, an emphasis on the theme that sexuality is an extremely powerful drive. That goes without saying. Everybody knows that. But because it is, it's uniquely prone to lead us into irrationality. And once it does, it tends to snowball. So Aquinas, for example, says that disordered sexual desire tends more than any other vice to blind the intellect, because you get very attached to certain whether it's through the use of pornography or through a relationship you have or whatever, you get very attached to certain fantasies and certain desires, and it becomes very hard to extricate yourself from them. It's like being stuck in a tar pit. You can't pull yourself out of it. And because it's associated with a kind of a very intense sort of pleasure, you don't want to get out of it. And so it's hard to sort of get your mind to see reality. And the very idea that there might be a reality that you're out of sync with becomes something that angers you. And you see also in Plato the theme that the tyrant, he has this analysis of how democratic or egalitarian societies tend to become more and more permissive and more intolerant of the very idea that there are better and worse desires. And he thinks tyranny arises out of this, because what happens is you get souls that are just overwhelmed with the desires, and the lower passions are controlling the way people think. And so he thinks that the tyrant is dominated most of all by disordered sexual desire. And I think what's happened is the sexual revolution has gotten more and more extreme, and more dominoes have fallen, and more barriers have fallen. You reach a point where it's a free-for-all, and every norm and every distinction is up for grabs. And try to uphold them, people find it intolerable, and they just want to shout bigot, transphobe, homophobe, whatever it is. And that reflects this overwhelming of rationality by desire. So I think that's why we've reached the stage we have right now. It's a kind of inevitable snowball effect of that the sexual revolution unleashed. It was inevitable. It was going to go in this direction at some point. To answer the other part of your question, yes, what can parents do about this? I mean, I think people for the 40, 50 years or so have been kind of browbeaten to thinking that they shouldn't talk about these things, and it's impolite and hateful and bigoted to talk about them and so forth. And obviously there are people who are loudmouths and they just want to shout how people are going to hell and all this kind of stuff, and it's not terribly helpful. Okay, fine, I understand that. But nevertheless, to just endlessly apologize for traditional moral teaching on this, or the church's teaching on it, and to pretend that somehow it's something to be embarrassed about, that's another part of the reason why we're in this mess now. because people who believe in traditional sexual morality have not had the courage to uphold it and to defend it and to present it in a frank way. It doesn't have to be presented in an aggressive way, but it needs to be presented in a frank way. And so I think it's important for people to respond to this, to do that, and to teach their children to stand by their convictions.
Well, let's turn to your new book now, All One in Christ: A Catholic Critique of Racism and Critical Race Theory. What motivated you to write this particular book?
Reading the critical race theory literature and the popularizations by people like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, it's among the most unpleasant reading I've ever done, because it's intellectually, it's a very low quality. You know, as a philosopher, you deal with a lot of ideas you don't agree with, but often they're interesting and engaging, and you know, you can find value in kind of thinking through a set of ideas that are alien. But critical race theory, these ideas, I think they're intellectually very flimsy. They're not defended with interesting or sophisticated arguments, and also there's a real a kind of malice and bitterness and hatred that comes through in this literature that's very unpleasant. But precisely for that reason, it's a book I felt I had to write, even though it's not something that I am interested in. It's not something I like thinking about or writing about. I'd much rather be doing other stuff. But when these ideas, you know, which were kind of, you know, I've heard this kind of stuff for years, but it was kind of on the periphery. And, you know, these sort of things you'd find in academia, but you could easily avoid them if you wanted to. But in 2020, suddenly everybody's talking, using this jargon and presenting these ideas drawn from critical race theory as if they were just settled conclusions that no reasonable or decent person could deny. And it was almost like a switch was flipped, and everybody was expected to go along with this new script and go along with these ideas, and they were very fanatical and dangerous. And so I thought, well, you know, people are pushing back against this, but people, especially in the context of the church, were not saying what I thought needed to be said about it. And so that was the reason for the book.
And what particular contributions do you believe that the church's teaching has to make in this area?
Well, I think that when you work through the basic themes of critical race theory, and then you work through the basic themes of Catholic social teaching, even though critical race theory is a relatively recent development and something that the church has not formally spoken on, though she has said things about race that are incompatible with critical race theory, but the church hasn't issued documents on critical race theory per se. But when you compare the two, you can see they're simply flatly incompatible. So I would say the fundamental theme of critical race theory is that racism absolutely permeates every nook and cranny of modern Western society, and the psyches and the attitudes of every citizen of Western society, including those who would regard themselves and be regarded as by others as totally rejecting racism and hostile to racism. So that includes even the traditional civil rights movement. When most people think of racism, they hear the word, they think of things like, the Ku Klux Klan and cross burnings, segregation, and things like that. And when they think of hostility to racism, they think of things like the traditional civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, anti-discrimination laws, colorblind laws and policies, and so on and so forth. But critical race theory says all of that is really just a mask for racism. And that even people who think of themselves as tolerant and liberal and hostile to racism are really harboring racist attitudes without knowing it, that the racism is so subtle that you don't even know you're a racist. This is a kind of extreme paranoid view of the world that is not the sort of thing you could actually give any evidence for or against, because racism is defined so broadly that it's basically anything that the critical race theorist wants to call racist. And it postulates that modern civilization is essentially a war between what it calls white supremacy and whiteness and white privilege and white fragility, all these buzz phrases on the one hand, and people of color on the other. And that these two forces are inherently at odds, that white identity is of its very nature hostile to non-whites. Now, if you look at the church's teaching, when the church condemned Marxism, for example, one reason for that condemnation was that Marxism posits that human societies are made up of irreducibly hostile economic classes that cannot cooperate, that of its very nature, economic life in social life is a war of inherently hostile forces, and the church condemns it. The church says, no, different classes in society are in partnership, and they ought to be, and they can be. Now, if the church condemns the idea that economic classes are of their very nature at odds with one another and hostile, and we're with one the oppressor and the other the oppressed, then she can hardly deny that that she could hardly fail to condemn the idea that races are inherently at odds with one another. Because critical race theory basically says the same thing that Marxism does about what Marxism says about class. Critical race theory says about race. It's not Marxism exactly, but it takes this theme from Marxism and transforms it into a theory of inherently hostile races as opposed to inherently hostile economic classes. That's just one way in which the idea is simply flatly at odds with the way Catholic social teaching understands human social life.
So, Ed, one of the most interesting stories I think we have just as a present day example about racism and the United States and people's ability to kind of pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. The life story of Clarence Thomas, who, of course, grew up in abject poverty in the South and who, was born in a house that didn't even have running water, to become one of the justices of the United States Supreme Court, I think speaks to a country that very much will want to move past seeing people only for the color of their skin. I mean, that just wouldn't happen, I would posit, in most of the other countries in the world. You couldn't have someone come not only from being a person of color, but from the kind of poverty that he was from. Have you ever spoken about that as a particular example, or are there others like it that you feel that are helpful and add to this conversation?
I haven't spoken of that particular example, but it does illustrate one of the difficulties with critical race theory, which is that it's not falsifiable. What do I mean by that? In the philosophy of science, it's often said that a good scientific theory, and whether we're talking about physics or chemistry or social science for that matter, if we're doing sociology or economics or political science or what have you, a good theory should make predictions about the way things go that we can go on and test. And one of the problems with critical race theory is it doesn't do that because it defines racism so broadly that nothing is allowed to count against the theory. So you give this example of Clarence Thomas, who rises to among the highest positions of authority in the country. And of course, you can give many others because there have been several Black Supreme Court justices now. President Obama, of course, was elected with large majorities of the country and so forth. And you give many examples of this that just give Oprah Winfrey is a billionaire and so forth. Many examples give the lie to the idea that the system is somehow rigged against non-whites. And so you might think, well, okay, if you're looking for actual empirical evidence, that would seem to be pretty strong falsifying evidence against the idea that the system is inherently racist. And you get very extreme claims made that even with the elimination of segregation and racism in the sense that most people think of it, critical race theorists often say, well, nothing really has changed, that racism is just now using different means to sustain itself. White supremacy is using different means to sustain itself. It becomes ever more elusive to find this alleged racism. And so when obviously falsifying evidence like that appears, and critical race theory just defines racism so broadly that that's not allowed to count against it, you can tell you're not dealing with a truly scientific theory, a truly social scientific theory, but I think it's really a kind of cultish thinking. It's below the level of reason. It's not rationality or evidence that's supporting it.
The reason I sort of like that example is because of the very specific role that the Catholic Church played in advancing Clarence Thomas to the very highest pinnacle for American lawyers to be a justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he cites a story of when he was in elementary school, and I can't remember the name of the Catholic religious woman who was teaching him. I think it was Sister Celestine or something like that. But he turned in really shipshod work, and she reprimanded him. And I think she gave him a D or something and said, Clarence, you are much better than this. And if I ever see a grade like this from you again, I'm going to go and talk to your grandparents. He said something clicked with him. He said, I knew she loved me, and I knew she loved who I was as a person. And it was, I just thought that summarizes, the church's love for each unique human being as a child of God. And, that's essentially what it was saying. She saw me as a child of God equal to any other student she'd ever taught, and loved me enough to correct me and to speak over my life. Clarence, you are a very smart young man, and this is beneath you. And he really took that to heart. And I mean, so much so that later in his life, he contemplated becoming a priest. And of course, there are other examples where we have seen people within the church not acting in that way, not seeing everybody's Christ in all people. I mean, the fact that Augustus Tolton, the first Black priest in the United States, had to be sent away to Rome to be ordained because no seminary here would take him, that speaks to a very shameful behavior on behalf of some people who were in positions of authority. But I don't think it's certain, but it doesn't capture what the church teaches about how we interact with other people of different races and cultures.
Well, that's correct. There are a number of points you raise, which, if I may, I would develop. So one of them is that, as that example illustrates, what fundamentally is essential to treating human beings decently and solving social problems is not ultimately laws that you're going to pass by Congress, by the House, by the Senate. Of course, that plays a role. But as the church has always emphasized from the very beginning, when she was hammering out her social teaching in the writings of people like Pope Leo in the late 19th century, fundamentally, all social order depends on the order of the family, and it also depends on the influence of the church. And so the popes emphasized over and over, and this was, in the 19th century when things economically for most people were much worse than they are now. They emphasized that you're not going to solve what they called the social problem apart from religion. If you don't have a revival of religion, you're ultimately just putting Band-Aids on things. You're dealing with symptoms, not causes. And if you don't have healthy families, it's the same thing. You're dealing with symptoms, not with causes. And so, the example you give of the influence that the church had on Clarence Thomas in his early life, and the way that flesh and blood human beings, rather than some law passed in distant Washington or what have you, were crucial to making this difference to his life and allowing him to rise to among the highest offices in the land, illustrates this point. You also mentioned that there were, of course, in those days, people who did not behave properly and did not act in a way that the church would require them to act with respect to people of different races. And that's been true for a long time. As I show in the book, though, the church's teaching has been clear and consistent on this for centuries. For example, you find for 500 years consistently the popes condemning the slave trade and what's called chattel slavery, which is what we normally think of when we think of slavery, which is treating another human being as a mere piece of property, as an animal or an inanimate object. And it's the sort of thing we think of when we think of slavery in the American South before the Civil War. And people act like the church condemning that's a recent development, that, maybe just at Vatican II or at the earliest, maybe in the late 19th century with Pope Leo, and that before that the church thought that sort of thing was fine. That's not true. One reason people are mistaken about that is they fail to distinguish slavery in that sense, which is what we normally think of, from other forms of servitude, like penal servitude, when someone is made a servant of another out of punishment for a crime, or indentured servitude, when they enter into servitude in payment of a debt or what have you. And the church tolerated those things for centuries without necessarily approving them, but just tolerated them. But that's different from chattel slavery, where you just take someone, an innocent person, and you make of him a piece of property, have total control over him. Church always condemned that. And where the slave trade is concerned, the modern slave trade, again, the popes condemned it from the very beginning. It's true that there were Catholics who did not abide by that teaching, just like today there are Catholics who don't abide by all kinds of aspects of the church's teaching. But the teaching was clear and consistent that this mistreatment of the American Indians, mistreatment of Africans in the slave trade, the popes consistently condemned that, as I document at length in the book.
Another example I think that gives lie to that, statement that the church has always had this rampant racism. If you look at the situation with Archbishop Joseph Rummel in New Orleans, when he decided in the very early 60s he was going to integrate his own Catholic school system in New Orleans, and was opposed by three local leaders in the community, and he excommunicated all three of them publicly. And they had the cheek, I love this, they had the cheek to write to Rome to ask Rome to reverse his decision. And they received a response that said, Black children are children in the house of the Lord. He's right. Which again, this is when racism was a very, very much an incendiary issue in the South in the early 60s, when schools were being desegregated. And the fact that the Holy See would take time to write back and say, no, you are wrong and your archbishop is right, and you need to reconcile yourself with the church, I thought just spoke volumes to the fact that, no, at the highest levels, like you say, there's all sorts of Catholics who don't follow the church's teaching 100%, or don't live their lives in a way that reflects what Christ would expect of them. But that doesn't mean in any way that this was something that's condoned in some way by the church.
Well, for sure. And it's also worth noting, with respect to that particular era, that Martin Luther King, though he wasn't Catholic, famously in the letter from Birmingham jail, when he's defending the rights of Black Americans and saying that they ought to be treated the same way as the rest of the citizens of the United States, he appeals to natural law and he appeals to Thomas Aquinas. And in part, he appeals to other things too. But what that points to is that that he was able to appeal to the same moral tradition, and one of the great thinkers, of course, that Catholics would regard as authoritative. So the roots of a condemnation of racism go deep in Catholic tradition, the teaching of the popes, and also in Catholic theology and philosophy.
How do you hope that your book can influence the conversation that we're having nationally as Catholics in specific?
Well, what I hope it will do is inform Catholics, both laymen and also priests and bishops, about the true nature of these ideas that are permeating, every aspect of our culture now, from entertainment to politics to education, and also in the church. Critical race theorists take advantage of people's goodwill and the fact that people are rightly opposed to racism. And so they paint their ideas as, quote, anti-racist. And people naturally think, well, gee, maybe this stuff's fine and we can dialogue with it and make use of it and so forth. But it's no more genuinely a remedy against racism than Marxism was genuinely a remedy against poverty and against economic oppression. Marxism just introduces an even more insidious oppression than the one it claims to overthrow. And critical race theory does the same. It introduces an extreme and radical divisiveness and hostility between races and a kind of paranoia that everybody's out to get you, and whites deep down, they don't even know it, that they're hostile to you and that they harbor racist attitudes and so forth. So this stuff can't be reconciled with the church's teaching, but people need to find out what it actually says. So I quote quite generously and extensively from the work of critical race theorists to show just how extreme these ideas are, and that when people say, "Oh, it's critical race theory, it's just about teaching history," and it's not, it's just a theory in law schools. It has no relevance to anything being taught in high schools and grade schools and so forth. That's all just propaganda. It's unbelievably cynical. It's just a bunch of lies. And so I quote in the book extensively from the work of actual critical race theorists so people can see just how extreme these ideas are. So I'm hoping that bishops, priests, Catholic laymen will inform themselves about it. They'll find my book helpful in informing themselves about it so they can resist this stuff.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to research and write it. It's going to be a tremendously helpful tool as people, seek to better understand what this means, especially as it's more broadly brought into academia, even at the younger levels. So I'm very grateful to you for writing it and researching it and then presenting it in such a compelling, articulate way.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.